Hello and welcome to the Authentic Freedom Virtual Church. My name is Lori Lumby and I'm the pastor and spiritual director of this online community. Let us pause for a moment in silence as we allow our minds and our hearts to be open to God's nourishment for us today. Wash bochlan chao bein walk dahin. I cannot of chenon shrochim lechaya bein. Wash bochlan chao bein walk dahin. I cannot of chenon shrochim lechaya bein. Wash bochlan chao bein walk dahin. I cannot of chenon shrochim lechaya bein. Today, I want to explore the topic of righteous anger. Righteous anger is relevant and pertinent to this week's gospel in particular. In this week's gospel, we see Jesus in the marketplace, in the temple, and we see him clearing the marketplace. Jesus was angry, and Jesus had a right to be angry. Jesus was angry because the high priests had imposed sacrificial requirements on the people, and marketers were taking advantage of those requirements in such a way that they became an obstacle to people having an intimate and loving relationship with God. People became so fixated on fulfilling the sacrificial requirements that were laid out in the law, that they were not able to enter into an intimate relationship with God. People were being taken advantage of, and laws were being imposed upon people that were not supportive or even working towards helping them cultivate an intimate and loving relationship with God. And this made Jesus angry. Jesus knew that the remedy to the pain of the human condition, that the path to the kingdom of heaven, to the kingdom of God, was not in fulfilling the sacrificial requirements of the law, but were in an opportunity to cultivate and nurture and develop an intimate connection with God. Jesus knew that fulfilling the sacrificial requirements were not helping people to know the love of God, to know the love of God that he had come to know within himself and that he sought to teach to others. And so Jesus became angry, and his anger was rightly placed. I'm not saying that we should enact violence in our anger, but that there are times in our lives where anger is appropriate. When we see injustices that are taking place in our world, when we see people being deprived of their basic human rights, when we see certain groups or genders or sexual orientations being denied basic human rights and principles, then we have a right to be angry. Anger in the face of injustice is appropriate. Again, I'm not saying that we should take that anger and put it towards violent acts, but that it's a natural human response to injustice. Another form of anger that is a natural human response is resentment. Resentment is a biological response to our needs not being met. And this is true of all human beings. Each and every one of us is called to know the love of God. Each and every one of us is compelled to seek to know that love within ourselves. And in that love, we are also compelled to identify what our own unique gifts are, to cultivate and nurture those gifts, and to live those gifts out freely in our world, and to be supported in the fullest possible expression of those gifts. When, in the human experience, we are thwarted in our journey of self-discovery, when we are denied the right to discover, nurture, and cultivate our gifts, or when we have asked for support in exploring this giftedness and our requests are denied, we become angry. What's difficult and challenging is that for many of us, we've been conditioned to believe that anger is wrong, that there's something wrong with us if we feel anger or resentment, and we feel guilty for feeling that way towards people that we might even love. This week's gospel reminds us that there is an appropriate place for anger in our lives. In fact, anger, especially in the form of resentment or in the face of injustice, is appropriate, well-placed, and is a signal from God that we are being invited into something else. In Jesus' case, he was invited to demonstrate how the law was being misplaced, how God's invitation to love was being distorted through requirements of sacrifice that was outside the capabilities of the majority of the people. And Jesus enacted that anger by pointing out the injustice and making it well known that these sacrifices were not well placed. In our own lives, we are all faced with situations where righteous anger is appropriate and where we might be feeling resentment because we know that our needs are not being met. That anger, that resentment, is simply a red flag saying to us, pay attention, pay attention. It's our soul trying to help us see more clearly what our needs are and how we are invited to ask for those needs to be met, and sometimes to ask more forcefully than we have in the past. And if those needs continue to be unmet and unsupported, sometimes it means leaving the relationships behind that are not in support of our highest good. And in leaving those relationships, finding those that are supportive. Jesus left behind the relationships that were not supportive of the path that God had called him to. And in leaving those relationships, opened his life up to those who would be in full support of his giftedness and of his call. Jesus left behind the temple sacrifices because they did not fulfill his own desire to know the love of God, and they did not match what he knew was the path to the kingdom. And so it is for us. We are invited, like Jesus, to look at our lives and to observe the obstacles. What are the things that are standing in the way of our ability to know the love of God? What are the things that are standing in the way of our ability to name and claim and nurture and be empowered in and share our own unique giftedness freely in the world? What are those obstacles? The obstacles that are within us, our fears, our false perceptions, our unhealed wounds, and the obstacles outside of us, unhealthy and unsupportive relationships. This week's gospel highlights the placement of righteous anger in our lives, the place for righteous anger in our lives. It highlights the role of resentment and how both of these can be signals of the Spirit. God speaking loudly to us to get our attention and supporting us in standing strong and firm in the path that God has planned for us. So this week, my intention is to lay down your guilt. Lay down any guilt that you have over righteous anger or feelings of resentment, and instead take a look at how God might be speaking to you deeply through those emotions. Jesus, in this week's gospel, cleared the temple. Our invitation is to clear the temple within ourselves.